On the morning I was supposed to feel proud of myself, I found out my husband had a whole other life. I had been waiting 3 years for that promotion, 3 years of staying late, of skipping vacations, of eating sad desk lunches while my colleagues slipped out early on Fridays. The day I was officially named Senior Cybersecurity Analyst for Hartwell Financial Group was the day I wore the new blazer I had been saving in my closet since February. I told myself I deserved it. I told myself finally's moving in the right direction. My name is Isla. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last 8 years of my career learning how to find the things people desperately do not want to be found. Digital footprints, corrupted logs, backdoor access points. I follow them the way a bloodhound follows a scent, patient and methodical and completely without mercy. My husband, Conrad, always joked that being married to me meant he could never get away with anything. We would laugh about it over dinner. I thought it was funny too back then. Conrad ran a mid-sized restaurant group out of Houston. 4 locations, each one carefully branded, each one reviewed in the right magazines and tagged by the right food bloggers. He had built the whole thing from a single lease on a shoebox space in Montrose, and he never let anyone forget it. He was charming the way certain men are charming, the kind of charm that fills a room and makes everyone feel chosen, until you notice it is applied equally to every person in the room, regardless of who is watching. We had been married 6 years. We lived in a brick house in the Heights with a porch swing we never used and a kitchen Conrad had renovated twice, because the first version was not quite right. I managed our household finances. I paid the quarterly taxes on his restaurant accounts because he said numbers gave him a headache. I monitored our joint investment portfolio every Sunday morning before he was awake, sitting at the kitchen island with my coffee while the neighborhood was still quiet. I thought I knew everything about our life together. That is the part that still makes me feel like an idiot when I let myself think about it. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. I had been at Hartwell for 6 weeks when the IT director flagged an unusual data transfer on one of the executive servers. It was minor, the kind of thing that could be a glitch, could be a careless employee syncing files to a personal cloud account, could be nothing. I ran a standard diagnostic and found that the transfer originated from an internal email address registered to the finance department. Routine. I pulled the access logs, cross-referenced the timestamps, and started working backward through the thread. The finance department at Hartwell had 3 employees. I had met all of them during orientation. The woman in the middle slot, the one who handled vendor disbursements and quarterly reconciliations, was named Petra. She was 27, neat, efficient, the kind of quiet that reads as competent rather than shy. She had started at Hartwell 8 months before I did. During my first week, she had shown me where the good coffee was and warned me that the second-floor printer jammed if you tried to use it before 10 in the morning. I liked her. I had no reason not to. I pulled her employee file to verify her access credentials against the server log. Her emergency contact was listed as Conrad Webb. I read it twice. I read it a third time, Conrad Webb. My husband's full legal name in a mandatory HR field that nobody bothers to lie about. I sat very still at my desk for approximately 45 seconds. I am aware it was 45 seconds because I watched the clock on my monitor without blinking. A normal person might have gasped, might have picked up her phone and called him immediately, might have walked down the hall to the finance department and asked Petra directly. But I had spent 8 years learning that the moment you alert someone to a breach, the evidence disappears. You do not move until you know exactly what you have. I closed the employee file. I took a slow breath. I drank the last 2 inches of my coffee, which had gone cold. Then I went back to the server log and started pulling everything. I want to be honest about what that afternoon felt like, because I think people imagine this kind of discovery as a dramatic implosion, a sudden avalanche of grief. What it actually felt like was a long gray hallway that I had to walk to the end of, before I was allowed to feel anything at all. I kept my face neutral. I answered 2 emails. I attended a 3 o'clock meeting about access permissions for a new software rollout. I laughed at something my manager said. I do not remember what it was. That evening, Conrad was home when I got there. He was at the kitchen island with a glass of bourbon, reading something on his phone, and he looked up when I came through the door and smiled at me the way he always did. Easy. Unguarded. The smile of a man who believes he is completely safe inside his own house. How was the first week of the real job? He asked. Good, I said. Long. I kissed him on the cheek and went upstairs to change, and while I was standing in our closet unbuttoning my blazer, I understood with absolute clarity that I was now operating in a different reality than the one I had walked into that morning. The only question was how far back the deception went. I did not tell him what I had found. I did not tell anyone. What I did instead was work. Over the next 10 days, I used every skill I had built over 8 years of cybersecurity work to reconstruct what had been happening inside my own marriage. I was careful about it. I used my personal laptop on a private network. I kept everything on an encrypted external drive that I stored in a lockbox at my office, the kind we use for client audit materials. I did not rush. Rushing is how you miss things, and I could not afford to miss anything. What I found was this. Conrad had been seeing Petra for 14 months. He had paid the security deposit on her apartment in Midtown, a figure I traced through a shell LLC he had set up under a variation of the restaurant group's name. He had funneled money out of the restaurant accounts by inflating supplier invoices. His general manager, a man I had met at 4 different holiday dinners and shaken hands with every single time, had been in on it. Together they had created a paper trail of fictional vendor payments, linen services, specialty produce distributors, equipment maintenance contracts that totaled, over 18 months, just under $400,000. $400,000. Laundered through restaurants. By my husband, who told me numbers gave him a headache. I sat with that number for a long time. The thing about discovering fraud when you are the person who was supposed to catch fraud professionally is that it generates a very specific kind of humiliation. Not just the betrayal of the affair, though that was its own particular wound. It was the precision of how stupid I had been made to look. I had audited corporate systems for almost a decade. I had testified in 2 federal proceedings as an expert witness. And I had been completely blind to what was happening inside my own household. He had been so certain I would not look. He had been so certain I would not think to look. That was the part I could not stop turning over in my mind, sitting alone in my home office at 11 at night while my husband slept 20 feet away. He had looked at everything I was and decided I was not a threat. That was his mistake. The Sunday dinner happened 2 weeks after I found the employee file. Conrad's parents hosted every 3rd Sunday at their house in Sugarland, a sprawling beige property with a 3-car garage and a backyard pool that his mother, Vivian, kept immaculate. Vivian was the kind of woman who described her schedule as full and meant it as a form of social currency. She ran a luxury event planning company, served on the board of 2 nonprofits, and maintained a very precise ranking of which family members were currently in her good graces. I had spent 6 years trying to move up that ranking. I had been largely unsuccessful. Conrad's older brother, Harold, was there with his wife. Harold worked in commercial real estate and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by anyone who mattered. His wife, a woman I will call my sister-in-law because she does not deserve the dignity of a name in this story, had the exact same energy. They arrived 40 minutes late, announced their tardiness loudly enough for the whole room to hear, and immediately began holding court in the living room about a property deal Harold was closing in Dallas. I sat on the far end of the sectional, listening, with a glass of sparkling water in my hand and the encrypted drive locked in my office at work, and 6 weeks of evidence sitting in my head like a quiet engine. Dinner was a roast Conrad's mother had spent 2 days preparing. The table was set the way Vivienne always set it, casual enough to claim it was effortless. We sat down. Conrad poured wine. His father said grace. And then Harold looked across the table at me and said, "So Isla, still doing the IT thing?" I smiled. "Cybersecurity, yeah." He waved his hand the way someone waves away a gnat. Right. Same idea though. You're basically just making sure nobody hacks the Wi-Fi password." His wife laughed. Conrad laughed. Vivian smiled into her glass. "Something like that," I said. Harold leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had never once felt the ground shift beneath him. "I don't know how you sit in front of a computer all day. That would kill me. I'm a people person. You have to be, in my business." He gestured at Conrad with his fork. "Your husband gets it. It's about the relationships, the handshake. You can't build anything real from behind a screen." "You're right," I said. "A lot of real things happen in person." Conrad looked at me briefly. I held my expression perfectly still. Vivian set down her wine glass. "I've always thought Isla was wasted in corporate work," she said pleasantly, in the tone she used when she was about to say something she had been saving. "You have such good instincts for people. You'd be brilliant doing something more social, event coordination, or even what I do. Working with clients, managing relationships." She tilted her head. Conrad's been saying he'd love for you to be more involved in the restaurant side, the hosting, the events, something that plays to your strengths. My strengths, I repeated. You're warm, Vivian said. To respond to that, it's a gift. It's just sitting behind a firewall all day. She made a small, sympathetic sound. It seems like such a waste of you. I looked at my mother-in-law. I looked at my husband, who was carefully not looking at me. I looked at Harold, who was already moving on to cutting his roast, already bored by the subject because it wasn't about him. And then I said, calmly, the way I say everything when I am working, actually, the firewall work is where it gets interesting. You'd be surprised what turns up in a standard audit. Invoice irregularities, payment anomalies, vendor accounts that don't quite match their paper documentation. I paused, just long enough. Companies lose enormous amounts of money to internal fraud. It usually takes someone patient enough to follow the numbers back to their source. The silence at the table lasted approximately 3 seconds. Conrad had gone very still. Harold was looking at me with the expression of someone trying to decide if he had just been insulted or if he was imagining it. Goodness, Vivienne said with a small laugh. It can be, I said and smiled and took a bite of my roast. I did not say anything else for the rest of dinner. I did not need to. The seed was planted. Conrad barely spoke milk on the drive home. When we walked through the front door, he said he was tired and went straight upstairs, and I sat on the couch we had bought together 3 years ago and looked at the wall for a long time. He came to me the next morning. I was making coffee when he walked into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the island looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not guilt exactly, something more calculated than either of those. What was that last night? He said. What was what? The thing about fraud. He kept his voice level. What exactly were you saying? I turned around to face him. I leaned against the counter with my mug in both hands and I looked at my husband, really looked at him, for the first time since the day I had found Petra's employee file. I was talking about my job, I said. Isla. He said my name like a warning. You should talk to your general manager, I said pleasantly. I think he's been having some billing issues with your produce supplier. The color drained out of Conrad's face so fast it was almost clinical to watch. He recovered quickly. That was the thing about Conrad. He was very good at recovering quickly, at reshaping his expression into something more controlled, something that looked like concern rather than terror. He crossed his arms. He tilted his head slightly. I don't know what you think you found, he said slowly, but you need to be very careful. You're making accusations based on, what? Something you saw at work? You're talking about my business, my livelihood. If you go around saying things like this to people, I haven't said anything to anyone, I said. Then gift happened fast. I had seen it in interviews before. The moment someone decides intimidation is a better strategy than denial. Conrad was not a stupid man. He understood that deflection was no longer working, and so he moved to the next tool in the kit. You know what you sound like, he said, his voice dropping into something colder. You sound paranoid. You've been stressed since you started this new job. You've been distant, He shook his head as if genuinely pained by what he was about to say. I've been worried about you. I've mentioned it to my mother. She's noticed it too. Your mother thinks I should coordinate events, I said. Isla, I'm being serious. If you go to anyone, my family, your colleagues, anyone, with whatever theory you've built inside your head, I will make sure everyone understands that you have been struggling, that you've been under enormous pressure. That this is, he gestured vaguely, that. I looked at my husband. I thought about the 45 seconds I had sat at my desk watching the clock. I thought about 10 days of work, of logs, of $400,000 traced back to its precise origin point. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay, Conrad. You're right, I've been stressed. I set my mug down on the counter. I'll drop it. The relief on his face was so immediate it was almost insulting. He actually reached out and put his hand on my shoulder, a practiced gesture of warmth that landed on me like something cold. Thank you, he said. I know this has been a hard transition. We can talk about everything later. When things are calmer. Sure, I said. Later. He kissed my forehead and left for work, and I stood in the kitchen until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then I picked my mug back up, finished my coffee, and went upstairs to get dressed. I had a meeting downtown that afternoon that had nothing to do with Hartwell Financial Group. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit operated out of a building on West Belt Drive that was exactly as unremarkable as it sounds. I had called ahead, I'd done my research. I knew that walk-ins without an appointment and without documented evidence were typically redirected to a tip line, which was where good cases went to die. So I did not walk in empty-handed. I had the encrypted drive. I had a printed summary, 12 pages, with the relevant account numbers, the LLC registration documents I had pulled from the Texas Secretary of State database, and a timeline of every flagged transaction going back 16 months. I had screenshots of the access logs, the vendor account discrepancies, and the wire transfer records I had traced to the shell company Conrad had set up to receive the laundered funds. I also had the employment record showing Petra listed Conrad as her emergency contact, because I wanted them to understand the full picture. The agent who met with me was named Torres. She was younger than I expected, with the kind of direct eye contact that told you she had heard every variety of story and was not easily impressed. She sat across from me in a small conference room and looked at my printed summary without touching it for the first 30 seconds, which I respected. "Walk me through how you obtained this," she said. I told her. I told her about the server diagnostic, about the access logs, about following the thread backward through the vendor accounts. I explained the LLC structure and how the invoices had been manufactured. I explained the timeline. Agent Torres looked at her partner, a quieter man named Wills who had said almost nothing since we sat down. Something passed between them. "Mrs. Webb," Tor said, "this is well documented. But some of what you're describing, the access logs, the vendor account data, that's information from your employer's internal systems, was pulling this data within the scope of your authorized access." "The server diagnostic was fully within my authorized scope," I said. "I was assigned to investigate an anomalous transfer by my IT director. Everything I found was in the ordinary course of that investigation." I paused. What I did on my personal time on a private network to verify what I had found, that's a separate question, but I'm not here to hand you inadmissible evidence. I'm here to tell you where to look. Torres leaned forward slightly. "Where to look? Conrad Webb and his general manager have been running a $400,000 skimming operation through the restaurant group for at least 18 months. The money moved through a shell LLC called CW Provisions. The registered agent is listed at a mailbox address on Westheimer. The primary recipient account is held at a private bank in the Cayman Islands." I folded my hands on the table. "If your forensic accountants pull the restaurant group's tax filings for the last 2 years alongside the actual vendor invoices, the discrepancy will be obvious. And if you subpoena the Hartwell financial records for the period when Petra was managing disbursements, I think you'll find some additional irregularities worth examining." Wills wrote something down. Torres looked at me for a long moment. "You've put this together very carefully," she said. "I'm a cybersecurity analyst," I said. "It's what I do. He's aware that you know?" "He believes I've dropped it." There was a pause. Torres picked up the printed summary. She looked at the first page, the second page, the timeline. She turned to the LLC registration document and studied it for almost a full minute. "Ms. Webb," she said finally, "I'm going to need to loop in our financial crimes team. If everything you're telling us checks out, and based on what I'm looking at, I have reason to believe it does, this is a matter for a federal grand jury, not a domestic dispute." She set the papers down. "Do not go home tonight." "I'm not," I said. "I made other arrangements." I had been staying at my colleague Adrian's apartment for 4 days by then. Adrian was the only person I had told, and I had told her only what she needed to know, that I was having some trouble at home and needed a place to stay, and that she should not mention it to anyone at work. Adrian was the kind of person who asked exactly one clarifying question and then never brought it up again. I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life. What happened over the next 3 weeks was, by any external measure, catastrophic. Conrad's attorney reached out to my cell phone on a Thursday morning. I had changed my primary number, and he had used the old one, which told me they were already rattled. The voicemail was smooth, professional, and contained the phrase "mutually beneficial resolution" twice. I did not return it. I forwarded it to Agent Torres instead. The federal investigation moved faster than I expected, which Torres later told me was because the paper trail I had provided was unusually clean. Most financial fraud cases involve months of digging through obscured records. Conrad and his general manager had been careful, but they had not been careful enough. And more importantly, they had not anticipated that the person most likely to notice the discrepancies was the woman they had collectively decided was not a threat. The restaurant group had a quarterly investor dinner. Conrad hosted it every year at the flagship location on Westheimer, a private event. by invitation only, where he presented the group's financials to his backers and pitched the expansion plans for the following year. It was one of the things he was genuinely good at, putting on a show for people who had given him money and making them feel certain they had made the right choice. I had attended every one of those dinners for 6 years. I knew the format, the venue, the caterer, the timeline. I knew Conrad always spent the first 40 minutes working the room before sitting down to speak. I knew the investors, 8 of them, mostly private individuals, one small fund, trusted him completely because he had cultivated that trust meticulously over years. I bought a ticket through the public-facing events page, which still listed the dinner as open to interested financial partners. It was not a lie, I was certainly interested. I wore a navy dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, not flashy, not trying to be noticed when I walked in. I wanted to be seated and quiet and completely unremarkable until the moment I chose not to be. Conrad saw me when I was halfway across the dining room. I watched it happen, the smooth social expression on his face, the mid-sentence pause, the fractional stiffening before he caught himself. He excused himself from the investor he was talking to and crossed the room to intercept me, and I gave him every second it took for him to reach me, standing completely still with a glass of water in my hand. "What are you doing here?" he said. Not a question. The smile was still in place, but his eyes were doing something entirely different. "I'm an interested financial partner," I said. "Isla." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that was meant to sound private but had the undercurrent of a threat. "You need to leave. Right now. We had an agreement. You said you dropped it." "I said I'd drop it," I agreed. "I didn't specify when." His jaw tightened. "If you do anything tonight to disrupt this event, I will call my attorney before you make it to your car. I will file for divorce by morning, and I will make sure every person in this room understands that you have been mentally unwell and acting erratically. My mother will back me up. Harold will back me up. You will spend the next 2 years fighting for your share of a marital estate you'll never be able to prove is fraudulent, and you'll do it while your professional reputation is in pieces." He believed this. That was the thing I kept coming back to, standing there listening to him. He genuinely believed that the threat of his family's testimony and his attorney's paperwork was sufficient to end the conversation. He had built his entire understanding of me on the premise that I was someone who could be managed. "Conrad," I said, "your investors deserve to know what's been happening with their money." I said it quietly, just between us, and I watched the color change in his face. He reached out and grabbed my arm. Not violently, firmly, the grip of a man who was used to guiding situations back under control through sheer physical presence. "Do not," he said. I looked down at his hand on my arm. I looked back up at him. "You should let go of me," I said. "There are 12 people in this room who are about to have a very important evening, and I'd like to have my arm available." He did not let go immediately. He waited 3 more seconds, which was exactly how long it took for him to remember that there were 8 investors watching from across the room, and that a man gripping his wife's arm at his own financial dinner was not a good look. He released me. "Thank you," I said, and walked toward the table where his investors had begun to sit down. What happened next took about 11 minutes. I did not make a speech. I did not project anything onto a screen. I sat down at the investor table while Conrad was still recovering across the room, and I introduced myself to the man on my left. A retired engineer named Douglas, who had been one of Conrad's original backers. And I asked him pleasantly if he had reviewed the most recent quarterly disbursement report. He said he had. He said it looked solid. I told him there were some vendor accounts in the report that might warrant a second look. I told him that I was a cybersecurity analyst who specialized in financial fraud, and that in the course of a routine audit at my company, I had noticed some patterns in the disbursement records that concerned me. I told him that federal investigators were already looking into it, and that he might want to consider speaking with an attorney before the next filing period. Douglas stared at me. He looked across the room at Conrad, who had just noticed where I was sitting. He looked back at me. "How long?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "At least 18 months, I said, "possibly longer." Douglas put down his fork. He looked at the man across the table, another investor, and something passed between them that did not require words. Conrad was already moving toward us. I could feel it without looking. I could hear the change in the ambient noise of the room, the way the conversation dropped as he crossed the floor. He reached the table just as Douglas stood up. "Conrad," Douglas said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that Conrad clearly recognized, because Conrad stopped moving. I think we need to talk. Not here. Douglas, whatever Isla has told you, we need to talk, Douglas said again. The doors at the back of the restaurant opened. Agent Torres walked in with Wills and 3 other agents, all of them carrying the particular quiet of people who have done this before and find no drama in it. They moved without urgency. They did not announce themselves loudly. They simply entered, and the room understood immediately that something had changed. Conrad turned. He saw Torres. He stood completely still for the span of 2 full breaths. Then he looked at me. I want to be careful about what I say here because I think people expect this moment to feel triumphant in a simple way, and it did not feel simple. He was my husband. I had loved him. Some part of me that I will probably spend a long time understanding had still been hoping, somewhere underneath all of the evidence and the encrypted drives and the 12-page summary, that I had gotten it wrong, that there was an explanation I had not thought of, that the man I had made a life with was not actually the man I had spent 6 weeks meticulously proving he was. He was. He absolutely was. Conrad was arrested at his own investor dinner, on a Thursday evening in April, in front of 8 people who had trusted him with their money. His general manager was picked up at the restaurant's second location 20 minutes later. The charges included wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. A combination that Torres had told me, when she called to confirm the timing, carries significant federal sentencing weight. The attorney who called me the following Monday was not Conrad's, it was Harold's. He left a long voicemail about family loyalty and legal exposure, and the importance of not making things worse than they already were. Vivian sent a text message that I read once and did not respond to. My sister-in-law called from a number I did not have saved and said nothing when I picked up, just breathed for 4 seconds and hung up. The restaurant group's assets were frozen within 72 hours of the arrest. The Shell LLC was dissolved. The private bank account in the Cayman Islands was identified and flagged through the FBI's mutual legal assistance process, which I had learned about 3 weeks earlier specifically for this purpose. Petra was not charged. She cooperated with the investigation, and it became clear, over the course of the federal proceedings, that she had not known about the fraud. She had known about the affair. She had not known where the money funding her apartment came from. I do not have simple feelings about this. I am still working on it. What I kept was everything I had brought into the marriage myself. My career, my savings, my professional reputation, and the quiet knowledge that when someone looked at me and decided I was not a threat, they had made the single most expensive miscalculation of their adult life. I moved into a rental in Montrose 6 weeks after the arrest. It was smaller than what I was used to. The kitchen was narrow and the bathroom fixtures were outdated, and there was a neighbor who played guitar badly on Tuesday evenings. I loved it. I loved it with an intensity that surprised me, because it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine for 6 years. Uncomplicated, unobserved, not performing anything for anyone. I still drink my coffee at the kitchen island on Sunday mornings. I still check the accounts. Old habits. The difference is that now, when I look at the numbers, they are exactly what they appear to be. And I understand, better than I ever did when I was building someone else's life alongside mine, that clarity is not something you inherit. It is something you earn. Sometimes you earn it the hard way. Sometimes you earn it by following a thread through the dark until you find out exactly where it leads and what it costs to finally let go of the version of the story you were telling yourself. I am not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect anger to be the thrill and the fuel, the thing that kept me moving through those weeks of careful, methodical work. It was not anger, it was precision. It was the absolute refusal to be wrong about what I knew. And in the end, when you have the evidence and you follow the evidence, and you let the evidence do exactly what evidence is designed to do, it turns out that is enough. You do not need to be loud. You do not need to threaten. You do not need to flip a table or give a speech, or walk into a ballroom in a dramatic gown, though I will admit the navy dress was a good choice. You just need to be the person they forgot to be afraid of, and then you let them remember.